celebrate who EDS has been, as well as who our parent institutions were that created this astounding place. I'm Matthew Cadwell. I'm one of the co-presidents of the Alumni Executive Committee, and I'm also sort of the resident EDS historian in a way. In the year 2000, we published, in honor of EDS's 25th anniversary, we published a history of the school, which I wrote, and we have some copies of it at the back, so yeah, thank you. So there are some copies at the back for those who may like it. Obviously, 25th anniversary, we're now at the, 43rd. So things are a little out of date, but some of the history is still worth knowing and remembering. There are some other history books about EDS that are also worth knowing about and maybe having. One, and several of these are at the back. This is the Episcopal Theological School, 1867 to 1943, by James Arthur Muller, who was a member of the faculty, and this is a fantastic book. One of the advantages that he had that I didn't is that a lot of the people he was writing about weren't living any longer, and so he could share stories in a way that I couldn't. So this, there's not so many, but there are some back there, and this is a fantastic read, and it will be a treasure if you have one, so I commend it to you. Another book, which we don't seem to have copies of back there, but sometimes you may find on ABE books or whatever, is this one by George Blackman, Faith and Freedom, a study of theological education and the Episcopal Theological School. It's denser than the Muller book, which is kind of a light read, and amusing and fun and things. This one is denser because it's... And in New Hampshire, right, okay. So this is a fan. It situates ETS and the founding of ETS in particular within theological education in the Episcopal Church and in the North American scene, and so it's also really worth knowing about and having. There's also a book, and I don't have it. It's small on the table back there, and it's a reflection on 70 years of Episcopal Theological School by Bishop William Lawrence, who of course was the dean of ETS until Phillips Brooks died. And then when Phillips Brooks died, he became Bishop of Massachusetts. It's a small book celebrating 70 years of the school. It too is a good read. Finally, there is a published history of Philadelphia Divinity School, 1857 to 1957, so a centenary history. And George West is the author of this one, or Stanley West. And it's not such a good read, but well, is he dead? He is dead, I think. Yeah. I think so. Well, yeah. Well, so it's mainly a collection of board minutes, which is why it's not such a fantastic read. But in terms of chronicling sort of the life of PDS, it's pretty much the resource that there is. Unfortunately, there aren't very many copies of it in physical that you can hold, but it is digitized. So Orafluid told me that the library digitized it so that it can be more readily reviewed as necessary. So those are a few. For those who are interested in EDS and ETS and PDS history, those are some good places to look. PDS was founded in 1857 at the eve of the Civil War. And as I said in my welcome to our new graduates, one of the hallmarks of the school from its founding was that it was open to students of all races and backgrounds. It was evangelical in its founding, as a contrast to General Seminary, but it wasn't in the South like Virginia, so that was sort of part of the reason for Philadelphia's founding. It had a lay board of trustees, and then it had a clergy board of overseers who they kind of jointly made decisions. It was sort of like a House and a Senate sort of thing for a while. Episcopal Theological School was founded 10 years later in 1867. And we wouldn't think of ETS or EDS today, EDS certainly, as being evangelical, but that's what its founding was as well. It was an evangelical school, as we know, and somewhat in contrast to Harvard, which was overwhelmingly Unitarian by that point, and a lot of people felt that, they didn't want their young Episcopal clergymen to be hanging around with Unitarians all the time, and so they so they founded ETS here, but they wanted it close to Harvard. They wanted the teaching to be open to the insights of Harvard and to the resources, the tremendous resources that Harvard offered. They just wanted it to be separate. Some of you may know that the chapel, St. John's Chapel, was the first building at Episcopal Theological School, and it was both a worshiping church for the seminary community, but it was also a parish church. And so people associated with the university, with Harvard University, they had to go to chapel. Students in particular had to go to church on Sundays. It was a requirement. So whatever your denomination was, you had to go to church. And so if you were Episcopalian, you could choose to go to Christ Church, or you could come to the St. John's Memorial Chapel and be in church here. So that's sort of something to think about, that it wasn't only a seminary community, but there was a wider community that was involved in the life here. And that's reflected as well, as you probably know, in the architecture of the buildings, rather than having a closed quadrangle, it's open by design to allow for influence from the world and from the university on to the seminary. I think that's all I'm going to say about some of that early history right now. And what our panelists are going to do is we're going to imagine that we are we're establishing a time capsule for Episcopal Divinity School and PDS and ETS. And I've asked our panelists to consider what would be a few things from your time as a student that you would want included in that time capsule. What wouldn't you want to be forgotten from your time at ETS or PDS or EDS? And that's not about stuff, right? That's about experiences and people and traditions that are important to us. Our first panelist will be Norm Fairmelli, who is from the Philadelphia Divinity School class of 1960. Is that right, Norm? And then an honorary doctorate from EDS in 2002, and a distinguished alumni awardee in 2013. Norm.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Matthew's already talked about this here and also at the commencement service. EDS has a long history in training African Americans for the ministry. PDS was early in that. It also trained women as deaconesses beginning in 1882. And in this time capsule, I'd like to include a book that was sponsored by Philadelphia Divinity School in 1907. The book is called The Negro in the South. They're essays by two people who represented really the tension in terms of racial justice issues. One was Booker T. Washington, and the other one was W.E.B. Du Bois. The book is called The Negro in the South. That's one of the things I'd like to see in the time capsule. From a personal standpoint, I had lived in Philadelphia a couple of years before going to Divinity School. I was well aware of the racial problems in Philadelphia. What I was not aware of how the church deals with them. In the first semester I was at PDS, there was a terrible incident in Levittown, Pennsylvania. There's a cross burning when African American families moved in. And the rector of a nearby Episcopal church came in, and we had a very good discussion in terms of how does the church relate to incidents like this and to deal with racial issues. So that's a very, it was a powerful symbol for me in terms of EDS. I went to EDS with a very strong technical background in engineering. I have very little literature, no philosophy, no sociology, and no you know, but so I found the courses very good there. They exposed me to something new that I had not seen before. I picked the school, as I mentioned to Matthew, because I was in Philadelphia and didn't want to move. So we didn't do it. We did not do a hunt. It was essentially, I'm going to go to the school that's nearby. And I went there at a time when EDS was coming back, PDS was coming back. It had some difficulties before. Standalone seminaries always seem to have governance problems and sometimes academic program problems. There seems to be something characteristic of that. But at PDS, I found that each year I went on, the faculty got stronger and stronger. John Skinner came, Richard Norris came, Dan Stevek, later on John Thompson, Ivan Kaufman, a very strong faculty corps. And the academic climate improved dramatically. But it wasn't bad to begin with. I mean, it was very good for me to have this exposure to new things. And I was very impressed with what EDS was doing. We had ups and downs at the school. Both EDS, PDS, and ETS were known for their broad range of coverage. But PDS had a lot of churchmanship fights. We had fights about pure doctrine, orthodoxy, and churchmanship. Well, I had just come over from the Roman Catholic Church, and I was not, this is a pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic Church. I was not particularly impressed with getting into arguments about the true faith. You know, I'd been there and I'd gone through it. But one of the things that impressed me about my colleagues, among the Anglo-Catholics, an enormous interest in urban ministry, in reaching out into the communities, in the poor communities of Philadelphia. That was very powerful for me to see that. It was powerful for me to see that outreach, and on the emblem, on a stole, it's "Do the work of an evangelist" from the Pastoral Epistles. That's the slogan of the school. Do the work of an evangelist. We had high and low church arguments, but it was very interesting to see how they evolved. Ups and downs, and as I mentioned before, that I was there luckily at a time when there were a lot of things going the right way, definitely moving in the right direction. After going to a suburban parish for a couple of years outside of New York City, I went back to Philadelphia, and worked with some of the people I went to school with. Met some great people in urban ministry there. Two of them were graduates of General, not PDS, the Andersons, Jesse Anderson Sr. and Jesse Anderson Jr. Jesse Anderson Jr. was in a parish not too far from my own in north of North Philadelphia, and Jesse Anderson Sr. Was involved in the director of St. Thomas's Church, which has an enormous significance in the Episcopal Church. And I was very pleased with that. I also had the opportunity to work with an individual that I found really amazing. He was a Church of the Advocate at the time, Paul Washington, a graduate of PDS in 1946. And Paul was just really a giant in the ministry there, in terms of his urban commitment, but also his demeanor and the way he approached issues. He was a mentor to many people. I had some of the people in our congregation who went down to the Advocate and vice versa. It was a very positive experience, and as you know, Church of the Advocate, Paul hosted the ordination of the Philadelphia 11 in 1974 on a day hotter than this, but that's the way Philadelphia is. most of the summer. So as I look at PDS with many fond memories and watch the evolution, I have to tell one more story about ETS. We didn't talk too much about seminaries, other than Nashotah was True High Church, General was the seminary, and I remember one day we talked about ETS, and Father Pottle, I don't know how many of you from Philadelphia remember Father Pottle. Father Pottle said, "Yes, there is," in his distinctive voice, "yes, there is ETS. and if there is any kind of contagious heresy, ETS will get it first. That was Father Pottle. But you know, after my second year and the new people coming, with the new administration, when Ed Harris coming, somehow PDS was growing closer to ETS. It was growing closer and was more liberal, still had the commitment to racial justice, less of a commitment to gender justice, particularly after the deaconess program was consolidated in New York City. But so we saw that natural evolution that took place. I was in Boston at that time. I'd been here 7 years, and I do remember an instance where I was teaching an adjunct professor here at ETS at that time. And Ed Harris called me and said, I want you to go down and talk to your colleagues and sell them on this merger. And I said, that's great. I've been in Boston 7 years. I'm teaching at ETS, and you want me to go down to Philadelphia and tell my colleagues it's wonderful if they come to Cambridge? And he said, maybe you got a point. There's one more story I want to tell, which is not PDS related, but it's ETS related. It was right around the time of the merger. Harvey Guthrie called me one day and he said, you're going to Philadelphia for the ordination? I said, yes. He said, why don't you call Bishop Burgess and tell him we're going? And I said, Harvey, I'm with an organization that's being funded by the diocese. Why don't you call him? You're the dean of ETS. So he called Bishop Burgess. And Bishop Burgess said, Harvey, I can't approve of this. Those of you who know Bishop Burgess, he was a very powerful individual, quite traditional in terms of church. He said, I cannot be involved in something like this. It's the right thing, but I can't do it. So he said, Harvey, if you go down and you take people with you going down there, there's going to have to be a disciplinary action. So when Harvey called back, he said, I asked him what the disciplinary action is, and he said, Harvey, how the hell do I know? But PDS, it was an evolution into ETS to form EDS, and now we're facing another evolution, which I hope has a Cambridge presence, but that's a matter for discussion at another time. The movement of EDS to New York.
Norm, thank you very much. So we'll continue with Mark Harris, who was at ETS sort of a little bit later from Norm at PDS, graduated in '67, and then received a D-Min here in '95.
Okay. Well, I came here 53 years ago, never having seen the school, never having been interviewed by anyone from the school, never having seen a catalog. The Rockefeller Brother Foundation had me as a second stringer for one of their grants, and said if I was really interested in going, I could always go to the Episcopal Theological School, had I heard of it. And I had vaguely. I lived in New Orleans, and the things that they said about the Episcopal Theological School were fairly scandalous, and that seemed just right. The only thing that I was assured by the Rockefeller Foundation was that the education would be a quality education, and that turned out to be wonderfully true. But what they didn't talk about, and what actually very few people at the school talked about, was ETS as a place of formation. In fact, I'm not sure they would have even known what the word formation meant in this context, but certainly they didn't talk about it. And after all, that was a hard time to talk about formation. What would we be formed for? Civil disorder was widespread, the threat of international disorder and war loomed even greater than usually because of the war in Vietnam, and the nuclear arms race was doing just fine, thank you very much. and love, peace, and understanding seemed no longer attached to the usual civil and religious structures. I didn't think that the Episcopal Church was particularly a place of love, peace, and understanding, but rather those things were a product of something new that was sometimes talked about in terms of New Age, where the source of strength was going to come from someplace quite different than the institutions themselves. So what in the world was ETS going to do about formation? I don't think it was particularly ready for it, but what it was able to do was to be open to it. That is to say, it carried on a tradition which was also true at PDS and was true of the daughter institution, EDS, of being open to all kinds of new things brought not by the faculty primarily, but by the students. I mean, if you attracted the right kind of students and they caused enough noise, you'd pay attention to that, and that what you taught and how you taught would change. That's not to say that the faculty didn't do a lot of that changing too, but the place of change was not in a school having a doctrine about formation, but rather in the school calling together a group of people and helping them to figure it out. At least that's what I thought was going on. And personally, I came to ETS supposedly married but without a wife, and seeking but without a church home. I had no bishop. A sense of engagement but no sense of vocation. I was, in other words, a seeker in a broken world, and my world was both personally and publicly broken. What ETS provided me in the mid-60s was that magic ingredient for social and personal formation that I was looking for. I didn't know I was looking for it, but here it was. I was formed by my relation to ETS as a community, also almost without knowing that it was happening. ETS was a strongly residential community in those days, with common meals, the daily round of chapel services, regular gatherings of students and faculty around issues. But my formation was really about long-term engagement with other students and faculty who bent my trajectory to meet theirs. I was formed by people in community, not by the school's practice of community. And I want to stress that because my experiences that live with me all the time about being in this school, both then and in the mid-90s, had to do with the people I met and the way in which they bent me towards a better understanding of my formation as a priest, as a Christian, as a scholar, you know, all that stuff. Maybe as a person. So 3 very brief memories. And because they're personal and because they're not particularly about the events of the age, but just about me, they're just little events, okay? Bill Wood, who is here tonight, was a consistent presence in those 3 years of formation, and he consistently pushed on issues about internationalization at a time when the school was not terribly interested in internationalization. It had a missionary society, you know, but they did sort of nice missionary things. They didn't think about international implications of Christian communities and what that meant in the world. He and I went to a conference that first year put on by Trans-Africa that was trying to link the civil rights movements in the States with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Now, the internationalist piece of that was what really caught my eye. When I went as an exchange student to the seminary in Puerto Rico, he was the only student here who really caught on as to why that was so exciting for me. Things were only beginning to boil on that kind of level that eventually ended up being in the combined school, the globalization and internationalization effort that Ian Douglas and others led here. But that's where it sort of started, and that's why it felt like It was an emerging kind of thing at the time. The second memory is after supper in the evening, for which we were required to wear coats and ties, for God's sakes, we would meet for the news down in a room down in Washburn Hall, in a lounge downstairs, and we would watch things unfold in their strange and wonderful ways. The war in Vietnam was getting worse and worse, and yet at the same time there was some hope that the civil rights actions in the United States would lead to the end of segregation, a segregated America. But afterwards, after the news, people would hang out and they would talk about all sorts of issues. And it was there that I first got a real sense of what the arguments for the ordination of women were really about. It was there that I began to have a sense that the gay and lesbian community was not only a reality in the seminary, but was a reality in the world with which we might have something to say from a seminary place. The third memory has to do with the fact that I supposedly came with a wife, which I didn't. And over that first year, it became apparent that my wife was leaving me. And at the same time, I met Catherine, who is also here in the group. And towards the end of that year, it became, let us say, it became clear to me that I was a doomed man, and that Catherine was it, and that was just fine, right? But it was the community that kept me as a single man that first year, mindful of my vows in marriage, and made me and forced me to sort of deal with those issues in a way which is more, let us say, adult and perceptive than I might otherwise have done so. And over the course of the following 2 years, this community saw our relationship grow, and we got married in this church right here in my senior year. And we've been at it for 50 years now, and it seems to be working. We'll see. But the issue that these three little vignettes have to do with is that I was formed by these things, in some cases with a great deal of anticipation and joy. I mean, I enjoyed thoroughly the discussions around international issues or linking the things that were going on in the world to what we were studying in school. I did not enjoy being paternalistically handled in terms of my personal life, but that was kind of what the church did in those days. You kind of got told what would be the right thing to do. I remember I've seen somebody in the elevator at the end of my first year and saying to them, "Do you think it would be all right with the community if I now went out on a date?" Dear God. I mean, to realize that you have to ask the community a question like that says both something very strong and positive about community, but let us say just a little dicey in terms of how you make your personal decisions. But those things all, to me, pointed out the immense value of being in a residential community for 3 years with people who you came to know so well that you could even put up with their paternalism. You could even put up with the fact that they didn't share your views on a variety of issues. You could put up with that because somehow or another you lived together with them, worked together with them, went to school with them. I have to say, I loved that. When I came back in the 90s to do my DMin, I loved being in whatever I could be part of in the community here at that time. I was aware that there was still community lively. It was changing the nature of community. It wasn't as residential. The question I have is, I believe theological education, as a result of my experience, is in fact entirely community-based. Based, that is, on the relationships you have with real, honest-to-God individuals who you meet face-to-face and you get kind of pissy with and you kind of carry on and have conversations with. The question is, how are you going to do that in an increasingly digitalized world and now in a world in which this particular way of doing our ministry, of teaching and learning, is not going to be here? It's going to be replaced by something else. So that's what I would include.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think Alan Gates is 2 years before Carol, so we'll continue with Alan, who's celebrating his 30th reunion.
Class of '87. Where are you? Yeah. All right. Yeah, gosh, the third oldest on the panel of 6. Thanks. I want to share first a memory in this space, and I'll bear the indulgence of faculty members who heard me share this story 2.5 years ago at matriculation. On a cold wintry day in 1986, we were gathered here in the chapel for Eucharist, and the celebrant and the homilist that day was Sue Hyatt, whom Matthew has already brought back into our world for us today. Sue, of course, was beloved by all for her combination of keen mind and warm heart and complete lack of ostentation. So Sue was preaching, and we were distracted and frustrated by the chapel's noisy heating system. When the steam came up, it would make this noise on the radiators that sounded like someone was wailing on the radiator with a sledgehammer. And it was this brash intrusion into our reflection on her homily. But finally, the great Thanksgiving began, and we all came and stood in the circle around the altar to receive the sacrament. Sue, those of you who knew her will recall that she was never too concerned about liturgical vestments. And it was a wet and slushy day outside, and so Sue had donned this pair of great rubber galoshes, and they were only fastened halfway up, so that they hung open at the top, and the buckles were flopping around beneath her alb as she walked around the circle to administer the sacrament. And she began to administer, and with each step that she took, her galoshes let out this great squishing sound as she made her way around. Unwittingly, I assume, she began to move around the circle in rhythm with the loud clang on the radiator. So what we got was this: the body of Christ, the bread of heaven, squish, squish, clang. The body of Christ, the bread of heaven, squish, squish, clang. We all avoided eye contact with each other because we knew if we made it, we would convulse. But the sacrament that day was given sincerely and accepted gratefully and remembered fondly. The body of Christ, the bread of heaven.
Squish, squish, clang.
Right. Worship here in St. John's Chapel was, at least in those days, mid-1980s, something of a battleground. It was just as challenging and just as nourishing as one allowed it to be, in spite of, or sometimes because of, that battleground nature. It was infused with the squish, squish reality, yes, that reality of the world around us, and disrupted by the harsh clang of prophetic word or disputatious conviction. The chapel was not, then, a setting of warmth and comfort, but coming to it with discipline and faithfulness and charity, and with the altar at the center of our prayers and, by God's grace, of our lives, and with mentors and companions like Sue Hyatt, we found ourselves nourished and challenged for faithful service. So my first nomination for the time capsule is Sue Hyatt's galoshes. And then I have one other, the large triangular landscaping planter outside of Wright Hall that remains to this day a dramatic feature. And in our days, I think it was even more so. There was an endowment fund, which I believe had some poignant story about a boy in the neighborhood who died and his family endowed it. So the endowment fund enabled the swapping out of the flowers with every seasonal change. So in the springtime, there would be these bright flowers, and then there would be something more subdued in the summer. And in the fall, there would be mums appearing in autumnal gold. And so one day in late November, the mums were gone, and the bare ground of that triangular raised bed was covered with clipped branches of evergreen strewn thickly across the bed. So I was standing there gazing at it, and I always failed Botany 101, so I was looking at these branches trying to think of what kind of greenery, were they pine or were they spruce or whatever, and another student came by. It was either Lori Hurt or Elaine Howlett, I'm not sure which, and I said to her, "Do you know what these are?" And she said, "Oh, well, this is EDS, and that is a non-hierarchical Christmas tree." So it was a great moment, a kind of emblematic moment, a light moment, but with an underlying serious question, which is, at what point is an evolved or reformed thing no longer still that thing? When is it something else, like a non-hierarchical Christmas tree? So it's a question, I think, implicitly begged at this school through the years, and maybe implicitly begged at a school which has held non-hierarchical structure as a core value while proclaiming itself part of a church that takes its name from a hierarchical structure, the Episcopal Church. So the paradox has been inherent in us, I suppose. What I want to say is that it seems to me that the line between ultimate meaning and ultimate absurdity is thin. And so we laugh together at our non-hierarchical Christmas trees, as we should, recognizing our common frailties and shared absurdities. And sometimes at EDS, I think in our era at least, we forgot that our wisdom was penultimate and our humanity frail, and we became incapable of laughter. I recall a particular occasion of mutual alienation and recrimination. It was Christmas of 1904. That's a story for a different day, but what Harvey Guthrie said in the aftermath of it was, "A hazard when we feel deeply passionate about something is that we can tend to over-exegete." So it was our hubris sometimes to laugh at one another instead of with one another. And if our charity failed, then so did we. So I've been holding that in mind in the last 2 years, thinking about the relationship between charity and hubris and absurdity and truth, and when a thing is no longer itself. So I'm not going to conclude that parable. I'll let you figure out an ending for yourself about that. But the second item for my capsule is a little hunk of non-hierarchical Christmas tree.
Thank you. So I'm pretty lucky that Alan is my bishop, and I'm really lucky.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to continue with Carol Gallagher, class of 1989, and sort of my partner in crime and agitation on the Alumni Executive Committee. Carol.
Everybody so far has been extraordinarily profound, so I'm going to take you down memory lane as an incredibly silly person. I came to EDS in the fall of 1986, so Alan and I overlapped for a year. We had 2 little girls with us. Ariel was 3 and Emily was 8, and we went home with 3 little girls. Phoebe was born between my middler and senior year here at EDS. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I grew up in a clergy household, but only had the experience of male clergy. And Alan is very right. We lived in a battleground state here in the chapel often, and I had no idea my first couple of weeks what human inclusive versus complete inclusive versus traditional language. I was very confused. So we started off, as some of you might remember from that era, having curriculum conferences. You remember the joy of curriculum conferences? Well, Jean Jersey and Carter were our folks who were in charge of it. Jean was a senior and Carter was our faculty advisor. And we were sharing stories about our history. They weren't always so much fun to listen to, but it is what it is. But one day, Carter was talking about her growing up in the South and that she had been a debutante. To which a classmate of mine, who was much smarter than I was, said, "Oh my God, Carter, that means you came out twice." So we decided that if that was the case, that we needed to have a prom. Do you remember the prom? Oh my God. Rand Chase was at that point, I think, the dean of students, poor man, and he agreed to let this happen. And we had in Washburn, in the basement, had canned music the first year and had a blast, and we elected a queen and a king of the prom. Really. And Carter came in a tuxedo, so she was elected king of the prom. And John Salmon, who was here as a Proctor Fellow, a priest from New Zealand, came, and he had gone out to a thrift store and bought a gold lame gown, sporting his beard and everything else, so he was the queen of the prom. I found out early on in this church that the only way that we're going to survive is have laughter. So I hope that we could put that, those 2 outfits in our time capsule. In my senior year, and I was struggling somewhat, not because I wasn't a good student, but because I had an infant and had to take my GOEs with a 4-month-old. So I was a little bit anxious, as nobody else is, I'm sure, when they're taking the GOEs. But it was the coffee hour questions. And who was the person that was the monitor for our coffee hour questions? And in those points, they were all hand done. Frederica was in that room. And I had worked all semester with Frederica on Native histories and issues, and I happened to be the David Pendleton Okerhater Award winner as a Native person here at this school. Well, one of the coffee hour questions was, who is David Pendleton Okerhater and why? Well, was it Catherine? Oh my God. I think I also asked Frederica at some point. I was a wreck, because if I answered the coffee hour question, you know these stupid dilemmas we get in, then I won't be anonymous anymore, and they'll know who I am, and they're going to reject me from the world and all that kind of stuff. So I finally screwed up my courage, went up and asked, well, what do I do? The answer was, just answer the damn question. I know it was Frederica that finally said, answer the damn question, which is the right advice. And so just that piece of paper that says, answer the damn question, is probably a really good thing to add to our time capsule. Because sometimes we overthink everything. graduates of this institution and her sister institutions. My last story is about Blessed Lloyd Patterson, who I was extraordinarily fond of and really found him to be one of the quirkiest human beings on the face of the earth, and I loved every minute of studying from him. I also had to prepare his twin sons for confirmation my last year of seminary, so it was pretty painful. But I struggled because the only experience I had, except for folks here at EDS, of clergy was male clergy. And I was struggling with what my identity would be like as a mother and all of those things. So I was sitting in Lloyd's office, he was my senior year advisor, and said, Lloyd, I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to imagine myself as a priest in this church. And here's what Lloyd said. Well, my good friend and I, Dick Norris, you know, Dick Norris, well, we have decided that the best image for priesthood is Julia Child, the French chef. And I said, oh, yeah? He said, yeah, because what she does is she teaches people to cook for themselves. She's not feeding people. She is initially feeding people, but she is teaching people how to cook for themselves. And then he went on to say, and if she drops a piece of chicken on the floor, she just picks it up, and she has a glass of wine, and she goes on. So I think I need to put something of Julia Child's in our time capsule as a reminder, and something of Lloyd and all the other wonderful faculty I had here who had a sense of humor despite the controversy and the pain and not understanding who we all were at any given moment, but that we could laugh and all of a sudden we were all the same human beings when we laughed together. So, thank you.
Carol. So next we're going to hear from Laurel Dykstra, a class of 97 and celebrating her 10th anniversary. And Laurel and I started at EDS on the very same day. Oh, 20th, yeah, 20th. And Laurel and I started at EDS on the very same day, and we lived together on the dizzying heights of the 3rd floor of Lawrence Hall. And Laurel, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. I came to Episcopal Divinity School because in the late 80s, I was the youth delegate of my diocese to a gathering in Bahia, Brazil, of the churches in the decade of churches in solidarity with women. Did you notice that solidarity decade? Did it pass you by? And I heard Carter speak, I heard Joan speak, I heard Frederica speak, and I thought, I want more of that. And that is why I came to this school. The things that I received at this school, the things that I take from this school, and my nominations for the time capsule are these. I want to put in the 22 years ago anti-racism manual from this school. 22 years ago, this school, the first thing that we did when we set foot on campus was anti-racism training. I was taught at this school to name racism, to name white supremacy, and to talk about privilege. The kind of training, and we didn't do it perfect, we didn't do it great, but we did it, and we kept on doing it. Those kinds of anti-oppression approaches, skills, and the quality of engagement and bounce back and respect and apology and true learning from one another are the kinds of things that prepared me for Idle No More, that prepared me for Black Lives Matter, that prepared me for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools, that prepared me for Standing Rock. And so the anti-racism manual from 22 years ago from this school has parts of it that we still use in my diocese now, in the Diocese of New Westminster, where we are considered at the forefront of some of the anti-racism work that we do in our church. When I came to EDS, I was a bit of an arrogant shit. Has anybody heard that word in church before? And I wasn't the only arrogant shit in my class. I thought that I really knew an awful lot about what prophetic Christianity was. And there were people entering my class who thought that they really knew an awful lot about different aspects of Christianity, an awful lot about different aspects of the right way to be queer in church, a different lot about all kinds of specific things, but there wasn't, when we came here, a kind of progressive orthodoxy that we had to adhere to. The dizzying heights of Lawrence Hall had broken bones, had broken alcohol bottles, had broken hearts, had sexual health crises, had psychiatric hospitalizations, had all kinds of the kind of humanity and engagement when people who are a bunch of arrogant chits who think that we know a lot about the kingdom come together and mash up against one another. The thing that I want to put in the time capsule from that time, from the kind of community formation that I received in this place, is the machine. The machine was a 17-pound laptop. It was this thick when closed. There was no hard return, or soft return rather, so when you typed, your typing just kept going until you clicked to have it come down to the end of the line. It was gifted to me by the Dean of St. John's in Victoria, British Columbia, because he knew that I was going away to seminary. And Matthew, who had no computer at all, and I shared that up and down the third floor hallway as we typed out our essays. And that kind of bridging and working out and cooperating and figuring one another out, despite the orthodoxies that we had come from, really epitomizes what has been good and what has been lasting for me about this school. The third thing that I want to talk about is the rigorous biblical scholarship that I was trained in at this school. It was taught in a remarkably, in the sense of labor and unions, practical way, that these are tools that will be useful to you across denomination, that will be useful to you across orientation in terms of conservative or progressive, whether you are evangelical or whether you come from a high church tradition, that the kind of rigor with which you engage Scripture practically will serve you wherever you go. And in addition to that worker-like quality of engaging Scripture was the notion that particularity, that race, that gender, that class, that sexuality, that those experiences, those places of origin, and indeed partiality, when named and claimed, made for better scriptural engagement, and that all the parts of Scripture were our heritage and our obligation to engage. And so especially to Angela Bauer and to Joanna Dewey, I owe a debt of gratitude that I put not in the time capsule, but that I carry in my heart, that I carry in my mind, that I carry in all the work that I do with Scripture leaving this place, and that I know that I'm not alone in carrying that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
I was thinking of putting the machine in the time capsule too, so I'm gonna think a little longer and invite Zena to speak. And Zena is the class of 08.
08. I'm actually I'm a little shocked about the amount of emotion that's kind of coming over me as I listen to stories. I've been wiping tears away as my colleagues have been speaking, because there's so much rich history and experience at EDS. And when I think about what would I leave in a time capsule, I think about a way of capturing the photos and the images of people who have been on this campus. And I'm not thinking about just faculty and students, but staff and administration and facilities and the cafeteria workers and the families, and because that really made this campus what it was. I think about foundations, and I was like, oh my gosh, we just keep telling these stories. But it was through those stories that somehow I've become so much more humane a person than when I left. And I'm sure that was part of it. A physical object, when I was here, I did an intern work resident with housing. So I would leave a set of housing keys. And I say that because as part of that job, I would welcome people to the campus after hours, usually on the weekends, middle of the night, and you really had this opportunity to see people in this ordinary space. I remember, and many of these people are still a part of my life in ways I would have never thought, like today. I remember this tall, lanky gentleman who would come in the summers and sometimes in the winter, very quiet, and he turned out to be a reverend from Long Island or from New York, very manable, very kind. Now he happens to be the Bishop of Western Massachusetts, where I am. And I serve on the Board of Trustees there and on the Social Justice Commission, and I met him and had a relationship with him prior to him being bishop. I think about the day where I was asked to go pick up someone from the airport. And at this point, I was like, you know, EDS, it's not really exciting, and I don't know, I'm missing home. I had to go pick up a bishop from North Carolina from the airport. And he came in here the next day, and he kind of slid across the floor one way and slid across the floor the other way. And Canon Rodman was back there saying, well, and I said, this is exciting. This is what I kind of needed. I later took that bishop to the airport, and his flight was delayed. And we had a meal at Red Lobster, and we sat and we talked. And I discerned about, I don't actually know if this ordination thing is for me. We had a really good conversation. He is now the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. Very good friend of mine. I think about some of the classes that I took here, and I can't go over all of them, but the irony is I took a spirituality and addiction class and a prayer class with Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, who is now someone who serves on the Social Justice Commission with me in the Diocese of Western Mass. I remember taking an Anglican class with Dr. Kajawa and Dr. Tomset, and there were times where I'm like, this is not really exciting, but I'm not done. I'm not done. We're talking about real back Anglican history. But Dr. Kajawa had all of these things that she brought into, because we'd have to do the pre-reading, and I'd be, oh my gosh. And then we'd get in the class, and she turned it into this kind of magical space where it was worth the learning. And I remember Dr. Tomset mentioning Verna Dozier, and I was like, what? I want to be Verna Dozier. That was the first I heard of Verna Dozier, and that's kind of been my inspiration in the Anglican sphere. I also remember taking I think it was a New Testament class by Rick, and he would come in class, he was always excited, and he would be writing on the board, and he would have all of this excitement, and I would ask myself, is he serious? Is he really this excited? about the Bible. Episcopalians don't even open the Bible. And he did it. He kept doing it, and he kept doing it. And then I realized the excitement, because I was thinking, I mean, he knows this stuff. He's been doing this stuff for years. And the excitement was more about the people in front of him and our ability to learn and our interest in it. And I teach in urban schools, and I come in there with all this excitement, and the students, the high school students, they're not as reserved as I was, and they would say things like, "Miss Link, are you really that excited about what we're learning?" And he did that to the last day of class, and I do too. I remember study abroad. I went to South Africa. I don't know if I would have ever made it had, given my class background, I don't know that I would have ever made it had it not been the opportunity that was presented to me through EDS. I went with Bill Condrath, Dr. Pouilon, and Karen Montagno, and it was a wonderful experience, and it was an academic experience and a social immersion, and it's one of the most fondest memories of my life. I feel like I'm leaving things out. Before coming here, I did a lot with racial disparities and injustices in society, but I left with a different lens, having did it through a spiritual capacity. Before, it was all through a social capacity, but to do that kind of learning and to be with people in a spiritual context made me grow in ways that I could never imagine, and it gave me the patience of a saint. How I do the work now, which I continue to do on a local and regional, diocesan, and national level, it was rooted in my experience here at EDS, because this is a community that never gives up on you. They hold you, they care for you, and they nurture you in ways that you couldn't even imagine. So I feel like there's something I'm leaving out. I would definitely leave those keys, and if there was a way to leave images, I would leave those images. And I guess the sadness and the heaviness on my heart is the uncertainty. And I think about what Frank talked about in his sermon yesterday. When I came here, my light was flickering. When I left, it was shining strong, and it will continue to stay steady and strong way after I'm gone. And I thank EDS for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do a couple as well. I'm from Minnesota, right? And I decided to look at seminaries when I was still in college. So I think I first wrote to EDS when I was 20 or 21 years old to find out about it, as well as other Episcopal seminaries. So I wrote to lots of Episcopal seminaries. And the response you get back when you do that is fascinating. Particularly, this was in 94. I started in 95, so 93, 94. So there was no email or anything like that at that point. So I wrote to just kind of vaguely to lots of seminaries and invited them to, send me a catalog or whatever. And the responses you get back were just fantastic. So unfortunately, the response from EDS wasn't all that good. They sent a catalog and a brochure for a visiting day that was already expired. So that was EDS. Then Virginia sent a catalog and a business card, and no letter or anything, just a catalog and a business card. Berkeley at Yale sent a Yale Divinity School catalog and a copy of the canons for the ordination process. Nashotah House sent because I was from Minnesota, right? Nashotah House sent a massive packet. It was huge, and with lots of newsletters and things like that, including in the catalog, it was a few years old, the catalog was a few years old, but there was a quotation in the catalog from a woman, student, who said, well, I thought it would be worse than it is. Seabury Western, they actually, they were the best. Seabury Western was the best in terms of response. They called me. I didn't even put my phone number on so they were stalking me, I guess, on the letter. But they called me. The admissions director called me, and more than once, and we had a fantastic conversation. And she put me in touch with someone from Minnesota who was going there and things. But then at one point she said, well, you know what? At Seabury Western, she said, we serve the broad mainstream of the Episcopal Church and not the radical fringe. And, okay, well, I wanted to be on the radical fringe, right? So I persisted and kept trying at EDS and ended up here the same day as Laurel when I was 22. Yeah, I was the second youngest student here for 2 years. Drew Van Kulen was like two months younger than me, so we were a pair of the youngest. And then Anna showed up, and a number of people were younger a few years later. So I wanted to be on the radical fringe, and I had read books by Carter Hayward and Bishop Spong, and I was so impressed by that Christian sensibility. And so on the machine, I wrote my essays for Carter Hayward's Christology class. And I wrote something about something that led to sort of a universalist kind of eschatology. And she said to me, she wrote back, and she said to me, you know, you should read F.D. Morris. You should read the chapter on eternal punishment and eternal life in the theological essays. And that changed my life. And it is so fantastic that here at EDS, you can take a class in Christology by a lesbian, feminist, radical, church-changing person, and she says, but you should read this guy from the 19th century. That conversation and engagement here was so profound in my life, for me. You know, when Carter taught that Christology class, she wasn't so good at the patristic era. And so she invited Lloyd in to teach that section for her. I still have Lloyd's lecture at home. That kind of conversation and engagement was so special here. So I might put that lecture in the time capsule. And at the same time, I might put that window of F.D. Morris and John Keble in that time capsule because, that window for me represents in a way what EDS is all about. Keble and Morris did not like each other. And yet there they are, memorialized in that window together. That's a fantastic thing. The second, my second thing is that Lloyd and Sue Hyatt retired the same year. They actually delayed, I think Lloyd technically retired the year before, but they delayed their retirement party to happen at the same time. Not because, they needed it to be at the same time, but I think they were both so shy in a way. They didn't want the attention, and so they thought if they had a partner, they could kind of go out together, right? And so I was among the students who were kind of organizing the Lloyd part of their retirement, and others were organizing the Sioux retirement. And so I put together a sort of a photo book of Lloyd pictures through life and things, and it was really wonderful. And the Sioux folks, they honored her with, so we had balloons in the refectory, right? And on the table, to anchor the balloons on the table, they used knee socks. So they filled knee socks with sand. What was it? Argyle knee socks, yeah, exactly. And so you had knee socks all over with balloons. So Lloyd and Sue retiring together, knee socks and all. So that's something that I would put in the time capsule as well. The last thing I want to say is that, so I came when I was 22 and I was really shy, and I was afraid. I was an MA student, actually, MATS like Laurel, and I decided that somehow that I was too shy and that I needed to grow. And so I decided to switch to the MDiv program so that I would have to take field ed and as a way to grow. So I went to Bill Condrath, and no, it's all good, it's all good, it's all good, it's all good. And I said, Bill, where should I go? What would be a good parish to go to? And we talked about what my interests were and things. And he thought about it, and he said, I think you should go to St. John's in Jamaica Plain with Ann Fowler. So I did. And that changed my life. So Ann was my field ed supervisor, and then I became a member of the parish, and she sponsored me for ordination. And then I needed to do another field ed, and so we talked, and I went to MIT, and Jane Gould was my field ed supervisor. Ann Fowler and Jane Gould. So among the people who influenced my life were Sue Hyatt and Carter Hayward. Frederica, who I didn't mention, but Frederica in a major way. Frederica invited me to be her TA twice and research assistant after my first or second year. And then Ann Fowler and Jane Gould. Me, a 25-year-old guy. All these women were foundational for me, as well as my beloved Lloyd, who I think of Lloyd every time I celebrate the Eucharist, actually, because I do the epiclesis the way Lloyd did. He did it with his palm down like this, rather than sort of chopping it, and I do it the same way as a memorial to Lloyd every Sunday. But all those women, and then I was ordained to the priesthood. I was the first person ordained to the priesthood by Bishop Gail Harris. Oh, wow. Isn't that something? That a 22-year-old guy from Minnesota could have an education and a formation like that. That's what EDS was and is. That's its power. I'm so thankful. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions because we have to go drink, and then we and then we have to eat. So we'll continue in the Washburn, the refectory building, in the downstairs is where our dinner is going to be, and the cocktails will be, or wine and whatever, will be outside in the hallway. So we'll retire to Washburn Hall and enjoy a conversation there. Thank you. History books in the back if you would like any of them.